Okay. Good morning, dear colleagues. Welcome back to our ACA seminar, What's New in Brussels. We are very happy to see you today at this early hour. So we are starting very early today. Nevertheless, we are, of course, full of energy and enthusiasm for the topics that we are looking and discussing today. Before I start with presenting the panel, just one technical question. Someone has left a white iPhone in the cloakroom, so you can all check, if your phone is around. And then, so if you're missing your phone, please get back to Courtney. She's keeping it for you. Yes, so it's safe. Okay, it's safe and sound. Right. Okay. So welcome to day 2 of our seminar, and the second day is dedicated to European affairs. So we are going to talk a lot about the European perspective of higher education collaboration. I have the pleasure to moderate this opening panel to look with you at the internationalization through the lens of divergent funding trends and increasing financial challenges. I have 4 excellent speakers with me today for this panel, and I start with Enora Bennetot Pruvot, who is my dear friend, a former colleague, and EUA's a big expert on funding, public policy development and governance. She is also the author of EUA's Public Funding Observatory and Autonomy Scorecard, 2 flagship initiatives that benchmark the trends in the field. I have also Florian Pecenka with us, the head of Unit for Education, Science and Research at the Austrian Permanent Representation to the European Union, who has been following the funding topic for very, very many years, both at national and European level. I have also with us Matteo Vespa, ESO's energetic president, who has been working also on the topic of higher education funding and governance in the setting of student movement at local, national and European level. Welcome, Matteo. And last but not least, I have also Adam Lipski from Frankfurt University of Applied Sciences with us, who has who brings on the table his hands-on experience with managing international collaboration, but also providing structured responses to all kind of crisis at the institutional level. So let me start by setting the scene for this panel a little bit. Last years have been marked by outstanding policy makers' interest in European higher education. So as you know, this has translated in bigger budget for Erasmus+, big ambitions in terms of new opportunities and priorities, but also broader portfolio of cooperation forms and formats supported by the program. There have also been some improvements in funding at the national level that compensated for the cuts which were applied in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2007. Quality investment is the prerequisite for higher education cooperation, and it has been addressed at the European level. For example, the European Education Area Strategic Framework Resolution invites the Commission to collaborate with member states and also to share good practice in this field. In the same spirit, the Council recommendation on building bridges for effective European higher education cooperation highlights the need for long-term funding for transnational cooperation and calls for more efficient and effective approaches based on pooling resources, for example, but also fostering synergies at national, regional and European levels. So that's the situation that has been evolving so far, but now we are also coming out of the pandemic and we are rushing immediately into the energy and inflation crisis that consume a lot of resources from all higher education actors, similar to other sectors of the economy, of course. So we can see that universities already face the immediate consequences of this crisis, and the long-term implications are yet to come. So this morning we will take stock a little bit of these developments in different levels, and we will hear from our panelists about the impact of the crisis, and we will jointly reflect on several questions. First, how to navigate this growing funding uncertainty and complexity, how to make effective choices about educational expenses, how to improve the funding line overall, pipeline, and how to sustain financially ongoing and future cooperation. So I start with the first round of exchanges with the panelists, and I would like to turn to Enora with a question about the impact of the current energy and inflation crisis on the sector. So we see all these alarming headlines in media, University World News, presenting, how drastic the situation is currently for universities. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe also speculate a bit on potential impact on universities' international cooperation? Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Veronica. Good morning to everybody. Thank you for waking up that early. I come here with the perspective of universities, and we do at EUA collect feedback from our membership, and our membership is both universities with about 850 universities over 48 countries, but also the national university associations. And so to prepare for this panel, we did talk to the national university associations, to understand what was going on, because it's very hard to get a consolidated picture of a very fast-moving crisis. And interestingly enough, we already had warning signs back in January 2022, when we had our Latvian colleagues telling us, the energy prices are going up, we might have an issue. And that was before the invasion to Ukraine. So we started collecting data, and we had a very recent round this January now to understand a bit what's going on. So sorry for the fact that I have notes here, but it is a number of countries to remember. But what we can see is very interestingly and very different from what we have seen during the pandemic, is that this is a very differentiated crisis, very differentiated impact according to a number of things. So not every system is, of course, impacted the same way by the energy crisis, energy price hikes. But also within systems, you have very different stories depending on what kind of university you're talking about. So first, it's where you are in the country. Obviously, you might have much stronger, bigger energy consumption if you were in colder areas. The profile, of course, so you have higher intensity in terms of energy use, for instance, in technical and art schools, for instance. Whether universities own their real estate, whether they have dormitories for students, and so on. So you have very different stories there. We also heard that a number of universities do have fixed contracts with energy providers until this summer. So these universities were shielded from a big part of the issue. Obviously, inflation still plays a big role. So that means the impact has been very different according to where you stand in Europe. We've had massive hits on finances in some universities and some systems overall. Austria is an interesting case because, of course, Austria has, I would say, the good practice of fixing the budget for universities for a 3-year period, which is quite unique in Europe. But the last budget was fixed in 2020, and then universities now in Austria face this massive price hikes. So when we can go back to that afterwards, there was action in the sector to remedy the issue. What we have seen in terms of actions that universities take is longer winter breaks, actually closing the campus over the holidays, which normally is not the case. We've seen that in Austria, we've seen that in Poland. We've seen in the Baltics, there was an early attention to the issue, and what they did was reshuffling the autumn semester to have a maximum of lectures in a concentrated time so that they could then close the facilities. And of course, energy-saving policies, and that's the basis, and everybody's doing it with the means that they have, of course. I mean, not everybody, depending on what kind of capacity and autonomy they have. What is very important is the shifting back online teaching provision was talked about at the beginning. It was a sort of an easy answer to some extent, but there was an early understanding that this is about shifting costs rather than reducing costs, and that is no longer, as far as we can tell and hear, this is no longer a big item. However, we see an impact of the previous crisis with the pandemic. For instance, the Swedes were explaining to us that, well, they no longer use large halls anymore because they have, changed the way they provide teaching, and so they don't have the large facilities, which is helping them cope now with the current crisis. So that, and a final point, maybe a focus on student hardship. We've seen that particularly in the UK and Slovakia and in Norway, where you do have a special attention to low-income students and staff to some extent. So this is a bit the picture we can paint at the moment.
Thank you very much, Enora. I think it is a very, very helpful overview, that helps us to frame a little bit the discussion today and also to understand in a more consistent way what is actually the impact of the crisis on the sector. One quick follow-up question. Are you aware of any immediate impact on international cooperation of universities? I assume there is some impact on the national student experience, by implementing all these changes. But I'm also happy to see that there was no major shift to online teaching only, which is quite important for ensuring, quality international student experience. Do you have any reflection on this?
There was no strong feedback on that aspect. I think there was no specific, let's say, attention or awareness of a specific issue there. There's a lot going through communication about reassuring incoming students, but that's already coming from the previous crisis in a way, so I guess universities are unfortunately getting used to having to communicate and reassure. And indeed, they communicate about not coming back online because indeed then the mobility becomes very unattractive. So that is clear. Of course, there are connected issues which are not directly, I think, related to the energy prices hikes, but we see a huge tension on student accommodation and so on, but I guess we will also get back to that.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to turn to Florian now. So Enora was explaining a little bit the situation in Austria, the feedback that they got from the Austrian National Rectors Conference. Some European countries recently introduced some changes that affect international higher education cooperation. We have the example of Norway, where tuition fees have recently been introduced for international students, and also the example of the Netherlands, where the recruitment of international students have been frozen temporarily because of accommodation and broader quality-related challenges. What's the situation in Austria? So where do you stand with international cooperation priorities at the moment? Has there been any impact on this so far?
Yeah. Good morning. I would like to start. I can confirm what you just said, Enora, for Austria. To respond to your question in one sentence, I would say business as usual. No reaction like in Norway or in the Netherlands. Maybe because of two factors. It's true that in Austria the university financing is based on performance contracts, 3 years. Advantage is you can plan with your money. Disadvantage is when you have a crisis, you have a problem. Because there is no flexibility. What did the university as a reaction? They started a media campaign asking for more money. And at the end, the ministry is sometimes like a business company. We have also some savings. And at the end of the day, the ministry gave additional 500 million euros to the Austrian universities to tackle the energy crisis. Another factor that might play also a role is climate change. Just simply the fact that so far we had quite mild winter. That means that the heating costs are not that high as expected. But in the cooperation as such, from the ministry side, it's business, it's up to the university to, well, we have of course our national strategies for international cooperation, social dimension and so on. But when it comes really on down to earth and to implement them, it's really up to the university. And that might be because we have a new, well, it's not new anymore, it's from 2002, this university law, which gives the university autonomy. So what we say is we give them some inputs, what we would like to see from them up to the next 3 years. We give them the money, but then it's up to them to manage in order to reach these goals. Yeah, that's it, what I could say at the moment.
Thank you very much, Florian. A very interesting example from Austria to see how, you know, the system can be both rigid and flexible at the same time. Good that you have some unspent margins that you can, you know, use to address the crisis. The question is, of course, what will happen in the next years. Let me please now turn to Matteo. So Enora started to talk a little bit about the impact on students and international students more specifically. I know, Matteo, you have prepared some fresh data for us, and you have some slides that will be now projected on the screen. So can you please tell us a little bit about the impact of the current situation on students, and also maybe also if you could reflect a little bit on students' ability to go abroad and also to participate in Erasmus Plus in the current setting.
Thank you very much. So if you go to the next slide, the first element that is important is that student poverty is a pan-European problem. It's also coupled with a pan-European housing crisis, which is linked not only to inflation but also to structural disinvestments in education, especially in public student housing. And here I took some of the examples from the newspapers from several countries. You can see from the north to the south, from the east to the west. This is, for instance, a first element that needs to be understood, in the sense that student poverty and the current crisis, of course, is linked to the Russian aggression to Ukraine, also to the energy crisis, and then the inflation that is linked to that. And that means that it's also a European problem that also needs to have European coordination that, at least for what regards the sector of education, has been lacking. And on this, also talking with the Commission and the Council, there's still, let's say, a kind of awareness raising that needs to be done towards these two institutions to understand that also from the education sector there should be a coordinated response. Another element that in the next slide that is important from Euro students is the fact that these are data from the 2019, if I remember well, is that even before the crisis, so there was already a problem linked to the student financial conditions, because as you can see here, there are different countries, but on average, 2/3 of student incomes was already going to cover basic needs, and we are talking here about food, transportation, and housing for students that were not living with their parents. And when you have already 2/3 of the budget that go to basic needs in times where you didn't have neither COVID nor inflation, that means that when hard time comes, as also Florian was saying, that it becomes also even more difficult. And this is also important because, as it is indicated, that the university didn't have the flexibility in Austria to let's say, replan the budget and needed the public support. The same was also for the students, and is still also for the students. And in some cases, this has been the case, but in others it wasn't. And we had also several cases where students were actually not included in the general support measures. It was, for instance, the initial case of Germany, due to the fact that the support was going basically to the people that were in employment, and students normally are not. So and this has been also linked, of course, with the issue of heating, in the sense that in many cases, as we said, there was fortunately not this shifting of further shifting of costs, we can say, from the public building as higher education institutions to the private households of students. But at the same time, of course, the inflation also hit it for what regards the general cost of food, but also general cost of heating. And this also, of course, had also an impact for international students. International students have both those that are normally enrolled, let's say, as for a full course, for a full program, but I would even say for more, for those that are actually in great mobility, that so have even, let's say, a less period to both to adapt and also to create, let's say, alternative safety nets to those that they have in their home countries and their home regions also suffered through that. And we can see in the next slide, together with the ESN, we had, it started actually with a case of Spanish students, Spanish Erasmus students in Italy that were literally stranded. And we understood that this problem was not just in Italy of international students that were actually finding problems in finding accommodation, but was actually more widespread. So we organized with ESN a survey towards the international students, especially Erasmus students, which had more than 8,000 answers, and we are actually preparing a report that will be up in the next months. But this is, for instance, already an important element. So why it is important to have scholarships and why it is important to have scholarships that are up to date. In this graph, you could basically say how much of the Erasmus costs, based on different nationalities, are cover the housing expenses. And as you can, if you can see that in the case of Polish students, that we have almost more than half that are covered by whose Erasmus grant covers the accommodation, but that means that basically it covers only that. So we have a big problem also with the current system of granting of the Erasmus funds that not only doesn't cover the accommodation, but doesn't even cover what was stated to be doing, which is cover the difference in the cost of living and studies between the country of origin and the country of studies. So I would say that this can be a little bit of a first introduction about the topic.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Again, very useful overview of the impact on students. I have one follow-up question. So, as you mentioned yourself, there were some corrections, right, to student aid and also to mobility lump sums under the Erasmus Plus program. Are they sufficient? You probably say no.
So, first of all, it is important that there has been, and if I can also say this was also it's linked to, let's put it like that, the fact that the energy crisis started to hit in the moment where we were approving the budget was useful, because when we were discussing with, for instance, say the top-ups, or better than top-ups, the increase in budget for what regards the Ukrainian students, so in order to have more funds that could be given for that, because we had data that this was not the case, that in many universities, for instance in France, the Erasmus funds were not sufficient in order to cover the possible demand. What we were told is that basically we needed to wait until basically now. So, we were talking about March and April. So on the one hand, that helped because the front loading was useful. At the same time, even if it would have been maybe enough for what regards the sum per se, the structural inequality of how the system is designed still is there. So if it wasn't a worsening of the situation, for sure it was not even let's say a significant improvement. I guess that the idea was more to try to avoid let's say a diminishment of the real amount of the subsidy, but it hasn't improved the situation of covering the expenses as it was before.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Adam and discuss a little bit the impact at the institutional level. Adam, so what is happening among institutional coordinators for Erasmus Plus, those who oversee institutional participation in Erasmus Plus and also in other cooperation programs? What kind of immediate challenges do you experience, Adam, or maybe you anticipate some also issues in the future?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks also for having me. Well, in summation, what we have to do as coordinators is, this all gets dumped on our plate, let's say, and we have to deal with it in sort of creative ways and also, solution-oriented ways. What I think we've learned is we just came out of one crisis, which was COVID, right? And maybe an anecdote here. So I have two hats, for those of you who've read my bio on your website. So I'm on the one hand the coordinator for the European program, mainly Erasmus Key Action 1, but then also I'm what is called like a safety manager for global mobility, right? This was granted to me. I'm very thankful also to my university leadership for giving me this opportunity. at the onset of the COVID crisis. And I've done workshops with colleagues before, pre-COVID, on risk management when it comes to global mobility, student mobility, staff mobility, et cetera. And then, for those of you who are a little bit familiar with crisis management and risk assessment, you have usually, two factors, very generally speaking. It's the impact of a given threat, and then it's the likelihood of the event, right? And then always, we used to give this example, impact at the very top level was the university has to shut down. And the audience usually was like rolling their eyes, yeah, right, the university's gonna shut down. I'd like to ask you, those of you who come from universities, whose university had shut down in the last 2 years? If you don't raise your hand, you're the minority now. And this is a very drastic, I don't know if we fully, understand what has happened. This is a very drastic impact. This impeded our operation, our functionalities at a very, very core level. And I think one thing that has happened is raising awareness for this possibility. But this also directly impacts not only the safety managers, but also the coordinators for the programs. We've just heard from Matteo what's going on with student mobility. And the second thing is, so the first thing I'd like to stress is that we cannot come out of one crisis just to work in another. Let's say the Ukraine situation, rising energy costs, et cetera, et cetera. If you're stuck in crisis mode, something's going wrong. This is also, a tenet of crisis management, basically. So I think what universities need to learn or adapt to, especially in the mobility sector, is, establishing a management style that is sort of along the lines of business continuity. Because if your systems keep crashing and come to a screeching halt because you're unprepared, you don't have time to do your core mission. And this is something you want to avoid. So, resilience is a key skill. It always has been, also according to the Erasmus service that have been conducted, but not only for the student or for the beneficiaries. Now it's also up to the administrators to gain and foster resilience. That's one thing. The other thing that you can see is an increasing, so the program structure, I think, as a rule of thumb, is becoming more complex. Especially the Erasmus program is trying to be more ambitious. The outreach into the institutions is increasing. We see the topic of sustainability, inclusion, we've talked about this yesterday to some extent. That means, and this is being mapped by the program architecture, so the brass tacks on the ground is you need to factor in this amount for a student who is in that situation. Is he traveling by green means, and so on and so forth. If you pair this with for example, housing crisis, students not being able or being or their mobilities, being in peril just because of the cost of living. One example was, and that was the first warning shot for us. We got a lot of info from Dutch universities last year, so that was 22 for the fall term, saying if your student has not secured housing until August 1st, they shouldn't come because they're not going to get any. And that puts a big pressure on us because we're in the midst of the process. If it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 students, we can manage. But what if that's 20 next year or 50 in the following year? You need to be creative with that. So the volatility is increasing. We're already expecting an increase for inflation in the call of 2023. That's going to end in a couple of days. And the question really is, how flexible can you stay with parameters changing at that pace? Because usually, and I think you all can agree, you plan out your processes sort of long term. Students complain, oh, I'm going in fall, why do I have to apply now and get all the documents in spring? Well, this is a challenge because I don't know what's going to happen in the fall of 23. So you deal with volatility, you have more areas that are affected by the European programs, which is a good thing. Internationalization is sort of like a horizontal topic. But again, this puts you as the coordinator on the spot. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Adam, and I don't envy your job, so you must be really not sleeping well the night. But thanks for also presenting and describing a little bit this system overload at the level of institutional coordinators. And again, we can see there is a lot of uncertainty, right? So we're not sure what will hit us next. So we have had an overview, of the impact from different stakeholders. Now let's go a little bit beyond beyond the complaining stage, and also talk a little bit about the responses that have been sort of made so far and taken so far by different stakeholders. I continue with you, Florian. So we know the Austrian national mobility and internationalization strategy is very advanced in terms of its in terms of its social dimension. It's called Many Routes to Internationalization, and it is a very sophisticated way actually to address these new priorities that are also there for Erasmus Plus program. So in your opinion, you know, in this new funding context, which is a bit more challenging, would it be possible for member states to keep these important nuances and also to deliver on the social and digitalization agenda?
I would like to react to Adam first, because I think you're absolutely right. But what I have observed is also the level of crisis management in member states. And I think it's a very diverse area because, for example, I think in Austria we tend to say that we are an island of happiness. You know, that many crises are surrounding us but not impacting Austria. And I think with the COVID crisis, we learned that crisis can have also a concrete impact in my country. And I give you maybe also another example that I find always very interesting also. I did Erasmus in Madrid, and Spain is also known for being or for having, they had a very serious challenge in terrorism, and not Austria. But a few years ago, we had also a terror attack in Vienna. And this is something, that, for example, that universities have also to think and discuss about it. And of course, we have also now, and I think if we try to find something positive now in the crisis, I think the positive thing is that we all had to learn to become crisis manager. Me as a role as an attaché here in Brussels, you know, I don't want to show you the thousands of WhatsApp messages that I got as from March 2020 and so on, and then emails, etc. And I think everybody has some similar experiences. But what helped us is that with time we set up a kind of mechanisms, formal, informally, and now the reaction to the actual crisis, in my view, is much more faster because we have already these mechanisms. Even in my ministry, we have set up a task force to respond to the COVID crisis, and copy-paste the same task force is now responsible for the Ukrainian and energy crisis. So I think there is also a first lesson learned that the systems have become more flexible. To come back to your questions, of course, it's always nice to have strategies, but if you don't have the necessary instrument, the best strategy doesn't work and doesn't bring you anything. And this is, of course, in the education field, I would say, the permanent battle that we have to fight. On the weekends, and everybody will agree, and you can ask everybody from the street up to the head of government, education is the most important in life. Yeah, that's very fine, yeah, we are all happy. But when in the morning you ask for money, you know, then he says, yeah, but you know, I have to give money to them, and then and so on. So, and then you really see that maybe when it comes to money, we are not that high on the agenda. And I mean, why should be Austria a different place than others? We are not. And we saw it again now when I just explained to you that we give 500 million euros to the universities. Where does the money come from? It's not fresh money. I mean, to be very sincere, I mean, it's not fresh money. It's money. There are savings from the ministry that the ministry now deblocks and gives to the university. And I agree also what you said. Of course, it depends on the type of university. A technical university, or like here, VetMed or medical university, has higher fixed cost than a general university. Although I have to say that in Austria we have very beautiful buildings and it's a horror to heat them. So it's a bit mixed. So what will be the fight? Of course, the fight will be the ministry fighting for more money, getting from the finance ministry. But what I see also is, and that's why I found it very interesting what you said, Mattia, about the housing situation and so on. What I observe, and maybe this is also more from an Austrian perspective because I'm not following every country, is of course the Austrian government is giving a lot of money to help the population in the energy crisis. You know, you get lots of discounts, and it's not only the federal government, it's also the local government. And now we have a big discussion if the governments, and I say it in plural, are not giving too much money. And it's not only to the citizen, but also to the businesses and companies and so on and so on. And maybe, and this might be a bit a nuance, because I know that in Austria, Erasmus students not only get funding from Erasmus program, but also national funding. And I know also not all member states do that. So maybe we are a bit in a privileged situation. What do I see is, of course, and as you said, we have the performance contracts, and of course each cycle comes to an end, and there will be the fight for the new ones. So the ministry has already started to talk to the finance ministry, saying that we have to be a priority in the coming years, because if we want to reach all our goals, more internationalization, more social dimension and so on, it means we have to go with the inflation. But I also think that we have to be realistic, that we might not get the amount that we would normally need in order to reach our goals 100%. And that's why I come back to what you said, Adam. We have also to be creative and flexible. I don't know how, and I don't know when, but I'm sure that, yes, we have to. And that's why I find it very interesting what you said about the impact, and the other one that I already forgot. But of course we all hope of more money, but what I see also a tendency is from certain member states, and especially also from my country, is, well, ask Brussels. You know, if you don't have enough money on the national level, the first idea is always to go to Brussels and ask for more money. As if Erasmus Plus would have a lot of money. Yes, we do have a lot of money, but it's also planned. I mean, Erasmus also has its own strategy. But this is a tendency that I really observe, and I think that there we have to be cautious, because Erasmus and Brussels is not the white angel that is going to solve all the problems. So I think also member states have to contribute in order to reach the goals, because at the end, the goals that we have in our strategies are reflected also what you said in the European education area and education and training 2030 and all these nice EU strategies. I mean, this is all interlinked. So at the end, if you want to have sufficient money, not more money, but sufficient money in order to reach all those goals, I think what we need is not a cooperation, but it's a common effort, you know, and that means the member state, but also the Commission and the European Parliament, and down the actors like the national agencies. And so it really needs to be a common effort of the whole education sector in order to be able to reach the goals that we have politically set up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florian. Very, very rich contribution to the discussion, and I would really like to piggyback on different aspects that you mentioned. First of all, good news that there is some there are some good processes at system level, right? So there are some lessons learned already from prior crises, and we can see both at the institutional and national level there are already reliable, let's say, tested systems in place. Also, many thanks for reminding us about this link between European funding and national funding, right? So European funds are not there to plug holes, you know, at the national level, and I know Enora at EUA has researched a lot about that, so it's also an important point, and this is also something to consider in the context of success rates, right? So if we have the lack of national funding for specific activities, then there is more demand for Erasmus Plus, and then as a result more interest and less funding for applicants. Let me now turn to you, Mateo, and maybe explain us a little bit what the students do actually to address the evolving crisis. So you have presented the situation is pretty drastic, but what kind of response do you propose, also maybe as part of the national European student associations?
Thank you. Actually, a reaction to the last element from Florian, which is very important, because elements. The first is that it's not the first time. Also, minister in the European Education Summit, in a panel that I was in, was basically saying also the same about the fact that even the minister finds sometimes difficult to have, you know, the finance minister finance education, and that is very interesting. And I think that this also, and I don't know if there is any Swedish or Spanish representative, but it can also be interesting, for instance, to restart the format of having meetings between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Education in the council, as it was in Finland, because it seems that it's the request that doesn't come only from the civil society, but it comes also from the ministers. So, and second element. Yes, I mean, Brussels is not, you know, the cow from which you can take everything, but at the same time, if there is the request by the ministries, by the governments to have funds from Brussels, then also those governments should also give the possibility for Brussels to have the funds. And here we are talking about own resources. We're talking about the revision of the fiscal framework. We are talking about the European semester. We are talking about the difficulties of establishing the recovery and resilience facility and what is going to be also the legacy. So it is also important that there is also the push, you know, to have also coherence in the request, and also in the policies to enable the actors to which the requests are addressed to have the possibility to answer these questions. And this probably we'll discuss it later, but it's a crucial point when we discuss, for instance, the fiscal framework. We are talking about whether we are going to have the possibility to invest or we'll need to cut in education in the next maybe even year. We don't know. For what regards the responses, so as we said, the crisis is a European crisis, but has, of course, different layers. And we launched a campaign called Education is Freezing that had two main elements. One was the awareness raising of the European dimension, in order to, not also for our unions, but also in general for the public, to understand that this is something that needs to be discussed at the European level, but also to coordinate, let's say, the measures at the national level. We have say a political platform that was approved in November at our General Assembly that has measures that should be done at the European level, but also guidelines of what could be done at the national and the local level. For what regards the European level, for instance, there needs to be an effort both by, I would say, DG Enora, but also DG EAC, for instance, in pushing and having the universities and the schools as critical infrastructures to be prioritized also for the energy purposes, as were hospitals. But it also means to tackle these elements at a concerted level. And I think that here we still have very much to work on, because I had several talks, and let's say that this European dimension of the spillover effect towards the higher education and towards the education sector of the energy crisis is still very much lacking. Not maybe there is something, as we said, for what regards Erasmus Plus for the mobile students, but there are not only mobile students, there are also all the other students that stay in their own countries, and in that there is no coordination. At the national level, there are several measures that could be done. In general, our student unions took the streets or demanded, for instance, either, for instance, with trade unions, for instance, in Belgium, but for the general elements of the energy crisis, or worked on awareness campaigns, for instance, in the UK, as another example, on the necessity to increase the student support, which means also grants, for instance. Other elements that could be could take in consideration, for instance, could be the freeze of the repayment of the loans if there is a loan system. The freeze of the tuition fees. In some cases, there were, for instance, talks in increasing the tuition fees. So in general, since the situation is very specific, and it was indicated also, sometimes changes from university to university, and also from country to country, the measures that can be taken, also the avenues are different. But at the same time, the European student movement has a common platform and also common guidelines on how this could be done at the national and the European level.
That's great. Thank you very much, Matteo. You touched upon a couple of aspects indeed that we will pick up in the final round. What actually we all do, you know, to make sure that we have sufficient resources in the next multi-annual financial framework. And now, Enora, turning to you, can you also tell us a little bit about how education institutions responded to the crisis so far, and to what extent universities collaborate also within the national rectors conferences to find some common solutions?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to see the sector response, so how the associations have coordinated with their members on that particular crisis. As we've explained, it's very differentiated. However, one key aspect of this crisis is that it's also cross-sectoral, right? So universities are not more affected than others in a way, and that makes it extremely difficult to decide how to go about advocacy to the public authorities. So the first thing national university associations did was collect data to get an understanding. And as we said, we have countries less affected than others, or we have countries in which some universities are more affected than others. And then the other aspect is political sensitivity. So how the society feels at the moment. Can we as universities go about and say, yeah, well, you know, it's really hard for us, while everybody's basically in the same boat. And so there were different choices made. Interestingly enough, for instance, the Irish universities, which still are in fixed contracts with energy providers, still decided to go ahead and have a campaign, while the Dutch universities, which had to renegotiate really unfavorable contracts with energy providers, decided not to campaign specifically on that, but rather ask about, you know, compensation for inflation. The Danes or the Swiss did not explicitly go into advocacy. But those that did, well, first they did their math. So they calculated what's the impact on our budgets, what are the projections for next year. And some very horrible figures came up before the winter, when the French, for instance, did their calculations and came up with figures that basically the cost of energy is going to impact 3 times more in our budget by 2023 than it was in 2021, which was still partially hybrid operations. So there was some advocacy, and the results so far have been mixed. You have cases where there's no specific support to universities, even when they asked for it. That would be the case in Spain or in Norway. You can have limited one-off support. So here is a bit of money to compensate for your energy costs. You have actually more comprehensive support packages, and the French authorities have gone down that route. Or if you look at Germany, I mean, the situation is very again, different depending on which land you're looking at, but we're getting a bit more comprehensive support packages. And then you also have those cases where it has coincided with budget negotiations, and then allocations in general were increased. And that's more in the systems where you had this kind of slow catch-up effect that we've seen for a couple of years. So allocations to universities have grown, and that should somehow mitigate the impact. And then we have, as Matteo mentioned, the specific support in terms of granting special status to universities, for instance, as protected users of energy. Romania and Poland have done that. Obviously, the Polish universities are in a even more complex situation because they're also facing a gigantic influx of the Ukrainian students. So they're really under pressure for already a good year now. And then you have the support to students, either specific, and that's quite rare, unfortunately, until now, or via household and specific support packages like in Latvia. So it's, again, some actions were successful, others not. In Austria, there was really, I think it was one of the first media campaigns that Austrian universities decided to go because they were left a bit disappointed, let's say, by the initial response. And well, they were positively surprised that actually society kind of, pushed together with them. So now they indeed have this half a billion euros package, which should compensate part of the expected costs. Now, of course, there's for me two elements on how do we take this forward. And it was interesting to hear Florian talk a lot about flexibility at all levels. I mean, we do need flexibility, flexibility also means, in many cases, more autonomy to universities to actually take creative decisions. I mean, you can be creative in a constrained environment. I mean, that's the whole point of haikus and everything. But you do need a bit more possibilities in terms of real estate management, borrowing to invest in your infrastructure, or to invest in greener IT and so on. So there's lots to be done there. And Adam's point was really important as well, the skills. I mean, we need to train ourselves, we need to get new skills to issues we didn't have to face at that pace 10 years ago. So we've learned a lot from the pandemic, and we're really trying to push the point of supporting universities in acquiring the flexibility and skills that is needed to address this permanent fast-changing pace, basically. And a final point on European funding, indeed not a cash cow, but it's more than that. We should not expect more European funding. I mean, we've been for years just trying to protect the European funding that goes to higher education and research. I mean, the education side is going rather well with Erasmus+. Obviously, Erasmus+ has also been given way more to achieve in terms of, you know, objectives, and you have the alliances and everything. But Horizon is a permanent battle to protect it so that it's not seen as a reserve for other crises, other priorities and so on. And that's going to be an enormous battle in the next upcoming MFF negotiation.
Thank you very much, Enora. Already you anticipate a little bit our final round, where we will talk about the future and what to do actually in the coming years. I would still like to get back to Adam, because he's our reality check, you know, so he can report again back on what's happening at institutions. Adam, how do you deal with this increasing volatility, you know? So how does your work day look like, you know? So, and also a question maybe about the strategic choices that are made at your institution regarding different cooperation opportunities, you know. So where do you go for funding? What do you fund through national funds? What do you fund through Erasmus+? And how all of that is coordinated institutionally?
Yeah, so if you really want to talk about my workday, I think that would be another panel. But you know, and it also pertains a lot. So I'm trying to answer this a little bit shorter, you know, to the future, and you know what we could do to ensure, you know, to maintain a level of flexibility, or to actually expand on that. So I mean, obviously, everything is linked. We talk about funding and strategic ambition. Everything is linked to goals that you need to meet. I mean, this is also what you touched on, right? And the problem is not only, I mean, I'm not only there to sort of manage funds that magically appear from Brussels at some point during the year. Then I do a project, I write a report, and that's it. You know, obviously, we all know this is tied to a strategic or strategic goals that the university have. They may not necessarily align with the goals that the funding entities have in mind, right? So you have to sort of consolidate those two and to see where there are synergies that you can use. The thing is, you know, why did I mention the project management? Because if we look, for example, at the student side, right, we do have degree programs that are totally dependent on the EU funding. I'm not going to mince words, and I think we all know this. So, you know, you attract students, you recruit, you know, with having in mind, I'm going to send this student to that country at some point during his or her career, and I am, you know, dependent on a constant influx of EU money. Otherwise, that's just not possible. And even if you were to make changes, I had a colleague once who compared a university to like a freight ship on the ocean. If you turn the wheel into one direction, you know the ship is going straight for the foreseeable future. And I think this is the reality when dealing with complex managerial structures, right? We also have to deal with that fact. So even if we get handed down a flexible solution, this is going to take time until it you know, has any visible impact on, you know, the overall thing. The other thing that's important to notice is that, you know, I was talking about alignment of goals. I mean, the universities are also looking to sort of maximize, given the conditions that they received, sort of to maximize their output and to sort of tweak the performance. So we've talked yesterday, for example, about funding in the ICM program line, right? And then if I see there's an increase, let's say in the region of sub-Saharan Africa, maybe I'm looking into, you know, going more into that direction, although that may not necessarily be why I had in mind originally, but this is the reality of things, right? And then if that is cut short, what do I do with this? Yeah, we'll see when it comes to volatility. I think this is the you know, insufficient or maybe disappointing answer I have to give. Flexibility and resilience are the key words. You know, we have to keep our goals in mind, project into the future, you know, on a midterm basis, maybe 2 years, 3 years into the future, what will happen, what is likely to happen. How do we prioritize? You know, of course I have to maybe give precedence to one study program that is dependent on funding over another. But this is what we do. So we're juggling funds, seeing, you know, where we have reserves and trying to make the best for the moment. I mean, the other thing, and then I'll close, is that, you know, with all the new program architecture that we see being implemented, the results are, you know, remain to be seen. So we are in the midst of something new. Crises are added on top of that. And then we'll have to wait, I think, at least another year until we can make any prediction of how things are going. Yeah, I could give you another example, but I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's fascinating, and thanks for reminding us about this maneuvering that you have to do between the institutional objectives on the one hand and also the funding opportunities on the other. And I also like your point about the importance of continuity for some strategic priorities, because if they're there, they should be there for quite a sufficient period of time so that institutions can have sustainable resource of funding to implement the activities in the related area. Thanks. So just we're a little bit running short of time as usual, but I would still like to have your concluding remarks, colleagues, on the future, you know. So now we're hitting the midterm evaluation of Erasmus+, also the final evaluation of the past program. We are about to start the negotiations on the next financial, multi-annual financial framework. So we're looking a little bit ahead at the future. You know, you talked about, you know, the advocacy of the sector, Matteo, you as well. Florian, you mentioned a little bit the situation from the perspective of a member state. So my question is first maybe to Matteo. So what is the ideal future program for students? You know, so if you have a magic wand, what would you like to change for the next program?
So yeah, we're talking about 2027. We are also working on that, also with several colleagues from different associations. So first of all, if we're talking about Erasmus, of course I would say more funds about Erasmus, but it's not just more funds, it's also a different, let's say, way of, for instance, calculating the funds. We have a program, like a project called Erasmus for All, where we're actually trying to provide a first draft of what could be done, a different calculation, more or less using the same budget in order to cover, really cover the difference between the living and studying costs or the between the departure and host city, because if you go to study in Paris, it's different than you go to study in Corsica in terms of cost of living. So first of all, I would say that. And also for Erasmus, there are things that are not linked to funds, but are linked to trust. And also with ESN, we have worked very much, for instance, in the HA working group to re-underline the fact that you need to start paying the Erasmus grants before you go. Because, for instance, that is important in order to give the first payment for the accommodation, for instance. And we still have 2/3 of the Erasmus grants that arrive that are installed after the students arrive. So they need to basically be able to afford to anticipate money. And then for what regards, for instance, the European education area, we have the whole discussion that on what should be the future. And here I would very much like to, first of all, to have a coherent vision. Sometimes it seems that we have several initiatives also within the process of European education area, but not what should be the vision between the system, the Bologna process, European higher education area, and the member states. And I think that I know that the Council is starting to have this kind of holistic conversation, and I hope that this also will spill over in a more comprehensive conversation that will also involve the stakeholder and the students. Then also we have for what regards the MFF, but even, as I was saying before, the reform of the fiscal framework and the European semester, which is a little bit on the sideline, but is still very much actually important, that are going to be before the 2027. And on that, it's going to be crucial, because what will be considered as investments, what will be considered as shielded also by the possible austerity measure for debt reduction, but also what will be included in the country-specific recommendations, whether education is going to be there, on what degrees, whether in the next, after the recovery and resilience facility, there will be a new instrument or there won't be nothing, whether in any case the logic of combining investments, big investments with big reforms linked to the country-specific recommendations is going to continue or not. From our perspective, we think that there should be something after 2027 as a substitute to the recovery and resilience facility. We think that those elements should be discussed, especially on the different sectors with the social dialogue, and consider, for instance, also students as part, and the different sectors as part of this kind of social dialogue. And we think that we need to have a thorough involvement of civil society and stakeholders, both in the designing and implementation of the goals and of the national plans. Because, and I will stop here, what we have learned from the hasty creation which was needed of the recovery and resilience plans is that not only the design but also now the implementation sees very little involvement of the final users and of the stakeholders, and this also creates big problems, because when you write, for instance, in your national plans, I want to modernize the higher education system, and this is on what you're going to be based, your evaluation by the Commission. Basically, you can put everything and anything, and there the safeguard to be sure that those reforms are also being accepted by those that will need to enact it, and will also either benefit or suffer from it, from the higher education institution to the students, is to ensure that there is stakeholder consultation. And on this, the Commission has an untapped potential.
Thank you very much, Matteo, for this very comprehensive and detailed overview. I'm reassured students are very well prepared, for the next negotiating period, and you have a very long vision. I'm turning immediately to Adam now. So what is your ideal Erasmus Plus program? What kind of improvements would you like to see? Also maybe a little bit picking, reflecting also on what Matteo said about grant management and possible improvements.
Yeah, thanks for, I can totally understand where you're coming from. And that, again, could be a discussion in and of itself, right? I mean, our stance has been, and I'll keep that part short, is that, and it pains me to say that, but if you're solely dependent on monies that are supposed to be a co-funding scheme, I always caution people to rely on that, because if you're really reliant on this, you may find yourself in hot waters down the road somewhere. When it comes to finances, I know this is very cynical in the situation that we're in currently, but if you depend on this money to do this, maybe postpone it until you're in a more, financially secure situation. This is what I would say. From our end, there's not a lot that we can do in terms of grant payment because of other, conditions that we can maybe discuss afterwards, sure. But one thing I'd like to raise, because you asked about, what would be, or you mentioned the magic wand. I have a magic checkbook. This is almost the same, but not quite, because you cannot beat people with it. I'm joking. But I think if you focus more on the goals that you want to achieve, because I mentioned, behind every funding scheme there's political goals, or there's certain goals. They don't need to be political necessarily, but I'll give you a concrete example of sort of what I mean by this. So you have the topic of inclusion, for example, right? So there's multiple ways to fund people who have fewer opportunities, quote unquote. I don't really like the term, but so if you think about somebody, who's let's say physically disabled, and I'm not a friend of political correctness, so please bleep that out if you need. Let's say there's somebody as a student in a wheelchair, right? I can pay him or her all the money that I want. If that person goes to university whose buildings are not wheelchair ready, they're not going to succeed, right? So what's the goal here? Maybe, and the paradoxical situation is then that money I have to sort of pay back to our NA, and then ultimately it goes back to Brussels. So the paradoxical situation is that we have a lot of money. NAs, when they redistribute fund, they have a couple of millions, in the case of Germany, lying around. Not lying around, but I'm trying to be dramatic here. So what if we think about more of like an incoming perspective? What if we enable universities to use this money to meet the specific goals formulated, let's say, by the Commission, right? So what if I give a infrastructure grant to the university saying, I make you ready to host a person in a wheelchair, or a person who's otherwise, impaired, or families who want to go on mobility, they don't have the daycare facilities to host those families. This is the same situation. I think the beneficial side effect is that people at the top level, like the top deciders at the universities, will see European grants coming in with different eyes. If I build a wheelchair ramp, I put a sticker on it, this has been funded by the European Union, that's a totally different impact than, the obscure guy who sits in a corner at this international office is always complaining. So maybe that is something to think about. Again, this is not a very concrete solution, but I think the way of thinking about this, we could maybe work on that and take a different approach. That would be my thing if I had a magic wand.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Adam. Also encouraging us to change the mindset a little bit and to see how we can still innovate, right, in the grant management pipeline. Very, very interesting. I think we can continue discussing this later. Quickly now turning to Enora for your last reflection on what can be done to build universities' resilience to future crises, but looking a little bit from the perspective of regulatory framework. So you started talking about autonomy, the need for autonomy, for more flexible institutional regulatory frameworks. Would you like to come back to this point a little bit?
Yeah, and trying to circle the square with bringing it back to internationalization as well, if I manage that. So yes, the future is in a bit more autonomy so that you can actually enable collaboration. Here I'm also not talking just about international collaboration, but also regional collaboration in terms of generating efficiencies. So simply joint procurement and all of these things. I mean, how do you act as a sector and save resources towards your core missions? So it's not about cost cutting, it's not about closing down programs or whatnot, but where can you make efficiencies so that you can focus on what you're supposed to be doing. So that's one element, the flexibility. The other thing is, I've got nothing against targeted funding. It's great that public authorities say, well, we want to support this particular line of action, so here's some money to do it. Not going to complain about it. But if you do that in a context where your core funding is eroding, you're effectively diminishing, well, first of all, autonomy, but also room for maneuver and resilience to manage the next crisis. So, and as a matter of fact, internationalization is a vastly complexifying environment and ecosystem, which goes much more beyond the simple mobilities that we knew years back, and therefore funding doesn't really follow that complexity. So the more and more it's about trying to find the bits and pieces and the funds that will help you sustain something that's larger, that's actually touching your core operations, particularly with alliances, for instance. I mean, internationalization is going really deep into the institutions now. So there is an issue there in terms of how you support that in a non-constraining way. The other element would be for me to really call on the European Commission to continue fostering this agenda and supporting it with tools and potentially with funding as well, because there's an increased disconnect between that and what we see on the ground. Like the national trends with regard to internationalization are not positive at the moment, and it's all quite under threat. We see it because of financial pressures. We see the dramatic decisions taken now in the Netherlands. We see it in Denmark, which is also a quite traditionally open system, where universities have been forced to relocate some of their activities. We see closing down on the number of English provided programs or foreign languages programs. So there is a an internationalization and an international attractiveness discourse on the one hand, but also quite negative action taken at the level of regulatory frameworks, or more and more obligations to basically rebalance a little bit there. So, which is can also be politically legitimate, but we see that with the very tense geopolitical environment, internationalization is no longer an absolute priority, and it might actually be considered a threat, and we have the whole knowledge security aspect there. So it's both on education and on the research side. So here we really need, I think, a strong ally and a reasonable one that actually can continue pushing this agenda as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Enora, for reminding us how difficult it will be actually to address the funding topic in the next years. And I'm finally turning to you, Florian, to conclude a little bit on the ambitious European education area agenda. I know that relies a lot on co-funding from member states. This is now the case for the European Universities Initiative and Alliances, so the Commission is appealing to member states to co-fund the initiative, but that could be maybe a case for the future, you know, where more collaborations could be co-funded at the national level. There has been so far quite a good political momentum, so a lot of visibility for European transnational higher education. How to keep this political momentum in this challenging context, and how to actually go into the negotiations prepared from your perspective?
Keeping the political momentum, hoping that there are no new crises coming up. The less crisis we have, the more time the political level has to focus and stay with the initiative. I think it is also from the European Universities Alliances the need to keep this momentum by showing the results through the workshops, conferences and so on. But I would like also to come back a bit what has been said about the vision for the ideal Erasmus program. I'm not a particularly visionary person, and I think you're much more down to earth and to know what is your vision, and I will hear about that. But what I would like to say is I'm more a realistic person. I think that each program has one leitmotif, as we say in German, no? One big theme. And the last one was, so I think the last two ones, simplification and flexibility was with the last one. I think the next one, the leitmotif will be synergies. And let's come back a bit what you said, Enora, with Horizon. Yeah? I mean, Horizon and Erasmus they are a victim of their success. I mean, when you have lots of money, then lots of people have great ideas and try to get the money. And unfortunately, Erasmus and Horizon, they have lots of money in the view of many people. We, of course, have a different view, but we have to be careful with that. And I think if we see the current crisis, energy, Ukraine war, possible upcoming economic crisis, those crises are going to stay, I'm afraid of. And that means that we have to prepare that we might not get the same amount, and if we get the same amount, we have to count with 10% inflation, so that means in reality we get less. That means that we have to have a serious discussion about synergies, and we see it also already in the current program in Horizon and Erasmus. If you look at the end, the number of programs that should be combined with, etc. And I think there is a lot of work to be done by the Commission and by ourselves, because what means synergies, it means also modularization, that I find a very interesting topic. And that we have seen with the European universities, by the way, but probably with limited success. Because what I'm thinking about, if you remember, I think it's the first wave of alliances who got financing also from Horizon. And there they had to set up, to send in a project and application and so on. And my vision would be that in the future, and it does not mean it only for the University Alliance, but whatever kind of project within Erasmus, you have a project and you have a chapter: mobility, research, digitalization, competences. You send one application to one single point in the Commission, and they say yes and no, and if it's yes, the funding comes from Digital EU, Erasmus, Horizon, and all the 10,000 other programs and names that even I don't know anymore, because every morning we have a new program. And that would be my vision. And I think this would encompass simplification, flexibility and synergies.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, you get your applause, Florian. Thank you very much. This sounds like a dream. Thank you for this closing remark. Colleagues, we still have a couple of minutes for any reactions from the audience or questions. So if you would like to maybe comment on a particular aspect that we have just discussed, or if you have any questions to the panelists, you are very welcome. We give you the floor to you now. So after this 1 hour of intensive discussions, we hope that you have also something to say to us. Yes, Juan, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Juan from ESN. Thank you so much for the panel. It was really, really interesting. I wanted to mention a bit the topic of synergies from a bit of a different perspective. You mentioned a couple of times how the Austrian government co-funds Erasmus, and like that's such a good practice. And what we have seen from the Erasmus Student Network is that this great practice does not have any European register. For instance, it's impossible to find data on which countries co-fund Erasmus, how they do it, which financial instruments. And from a, let's say, policy analysis perspective, this is terrible because then we cannot build on each other's practices, stakeholders cannot get involved. And the same, last year when I attended the meeting with some colleagues of the national agencies, there was a session on synergies between EU programs, right? And of course, now when it comes to synergies, people have been talking about the seal of excellence, etc., in which there's no money involved, right? So the synergy, I don't know where it is, but that's another discussion. But actually, the synergies with the European Social Fund were mentioned, and it's the same. Nobody knows anything. Like, the presentation, the Commission had a fantastic presentation, but it was the first time in my life seeing that information. It's not accessible online. And many colleagues in the NAs didn't know it either. So I think that a core priority now with this increase in the financial cost, etc., should be to explore more in depth these possibilities that are there. I think that probably many of us saw the synergies that DIA did, that the German government did with Erasmus+, and we were very surprised because this information is not publicly available and it's not part of the normal Erasmus cycle. So I don't know, like also if you have any reflections on this, on how to improve it, but from our side, making this a priority, both in terms of synergies at the national level, at the collection of evidence and data from that, and also more information on the possibilities within the MFF, it's quite important to tackle inclusion, to tackle the improvement of the program, etc. So yes, I would love to, to hear if you have already been looking into this field, if there are any ideas that you believe can be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan, for raising the importance of data, right, and coherent and consistent data on this important topic of synergies, something that we also take note of. Any further questions, comments from the panelists, comments from the audience? Yes.
And what Juan said is very true, because, for instance, there was a study of the Parliament on how the NAs were interpreting the European provision of you need to help socioeconomic, like students with a difficult socioeconomic background, because since there was this, as of now, at least no European, let's say, definition of what it means. Basically, it was given to the national agency. So there was that kind of study, but it is absolutely not enough, because those kind of top-ups that we are talking about are also journalistic. For instance, in Italy, I think at least for that it's a good example, because the ministry gives the ministry and with the possibility with the universities to add other top-ups, give top-up funding to the Erasmus plus grant based on your income or your household income. And it's something, for instance, that we take for granted, but it's not. So yeah, I would like to re-underline that some studies from the Parliament were there, but it is true that we still need to have a more comprehensive discussion. And probably, if it's true, as it was said about the synergies, also this kind of data needs to enter when we are discussing about the midterm evaluation of the Erasmus program.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Colleagues, let me thank you for your great inputs to the discussion. They are very, very valuable, and I see that there is a lot of potential to continue these discussions in the context of the midterm evaluation of Erasmus Plus, and also thinking, you know, more long-term about the future success of the program. Thank you very much. So now we will have a coffee break, and then we will proceed with the parallel rooms, parallel breakout sessions, and then there's still one panel on the European Universities Alliances after the parallel sessions. Thank you very much, and see you soon.